So now we come to the evening's main event, about which I am very excited, and it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and the moderator of the first session of this three-evening event. The session is titled Shifting Contours of Governance and Provision, Civil Society and the State. Professor Alan Zarychta is an assistant professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice. His research focuses on the politics of social services in Central and South America, with a particular interest in public health and environmental policy. He also investigates the sources and effects of institutional reform aiming to improve local service delivery. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zarychta to the stage, and he'll introduce the panel.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us for tonight's panel, Shifting Contours of Governance and Provision, Civil Society and the State. While the political structures and nature of governance differ significantly between the United States and China, what animates this panel is the fact that both cases, there has been increasing reliance on non-governmental actors to implement social welfare policy. This has included contracting out services to private organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit varieties, co-production arrangements between the state and civil society organizations, and various forms of collaborative governance. In fact, these are trends that can be seen across many contexts globally. The exceptional group of scholars we have on the panel this evening will help us examine the nature of this shifting relationship between state and non-state actors in both the Chinese and US contexts, and discuss how this affects public policy and service delivery to promote welfare and address inequality. Toward that end, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Xueguang Zhou, who is the Kuo-Ting Lee Professor of Economic Development and Professor of Sociology at Stanford University, as well as Senior Fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies. Professor Zhou's main area of research is on institutional changes in contemporary Chinese society, particularly focusing on Chinese organizations and management, social inequality, and state-society relationships. Professor Zhou has a new book forthcoming from Cambridge University Press titled The Logic of Governance in China, an Organizational Approach, which draws on more than a decade of field research to help analyze and understand major features of governance practice in contemporary China. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zhou.
Thank you, Alan. And it is nice to meet you all virtually. Can you hear me? Great. It is really a fascinating occasion to discuss governance and civil society in comparison between the US and China. And I want to focus on the role of NGOs in my brief chat over here. As we all know, NGOs arise in response to governance challenges in those areas where governments fail to deliver or have great difficulties to do it properly, either because they have limited capacities or they have limitations in information gathering or processing. And NGOs can supplement, complement, or even substitute for governance in these areas. And this is why this comparison between the US and China is especially useful. Among all the major economies in the world, the US and China are located at the opposite end of this spectrum in terms of governance styles. At one extreme, the US is characterized by small and limited governments, and governments at all levels, federal, state, and county, local level, they are autonomous more or less across these levels. At the other extreme of the spectrum, the Chinese government has a huge government apparatus, from central to local governments, and they are organized by a top-down hierarchy. So it is not surprising that we observe two distinct governance styles in these two societies. In the US, NGOs are in great demand, and they have flourished. There are many types and sources of NGOs based on charities, churches, and all kinds of voluntary groups or formal organizations. In China, NGOs have developed only to some limited extent, in my view. And in recent years, there have been really a great effort to try to put NGOs under government control and to make them as an extended arm of the government. Almost all NGOs today, as far as I understand, are subcontracted to carry out the social and welfare tasks designated by local governments. And this state NGO integration in China has its advantages. It can better coordinate and accomplish public policy goals in some areas, such as poverty alleviation or providing community support in neighborhoods with great resources and considerable organizing capacities. In this regard, I think the Chinese government and the social organizations there have made some remarkable achievements. But there are also difficulties associated with this state-centered approach. First, governments tend to have limited capacities in collecting diverse information about the needs of different kinds of social groups. Or even if they get such information, they have difficulty to process information to address diverse needs or to respond in a timely manner. In contrast, NGOs of different kinds tend to do a much better job in attending to these diverse needs of these different kinds of social groups. And the second, when the government takes over in all areas of activities, it really changes the relationship between governments and NGOs from partnership to subordination hierarchy. It also changes the incentives and organizational goals of the NGOs. So in that way, it really changes the NGOs to be part of the state sector and defeating, I think, the very purpose of NGOs in the first place. So in my view, the NGOs is really important in the Chinese context, where civil society has not well developed. Don't get me wrong, I think Chinese people care about each other and really want to help. But the Chinese culture cultivates mutual support, mostly through families and kinships. And the rise of NGOs, I think, played a very important role to bring individuals into public spheres and to help them grow into responsible citizens. So there's a lot of issues to think through and much to learn in the US-China comparison. And I look forward to hearing and learning from our panelists and our participants in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhou. Our next speaker will be Dr. Jennifer Mosley, who is Associate Professor in the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice here at the University of Chicago, as well as Editor-in-Chief of the Social Service Review. Professor Mosley studies the role of nonprofit organizations as political actors, specifically the ways in which human service organizations, community-based nonprofits, and philanthropic foundations advocate for or implement policy change that affects underrepresented populations. She's particularly interested in the relationship between advocacy and improved democratic representation, and how contemporary trends, like collaborative governance and contracting, affect the public policy roles of nonprofit organizations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mosley.
Thanks, Alan. So like he was saying, one of the things that I want to really encourage us to think a little bit about tonight is about all the different roles that nonprofit organizations play. So not just as charitable entities or as service providers, but also as independent entities with an important political voice. So I think particularly given their increasing service provision role, thinking about the kinds of expertise that they can provide, right, and how they can improve government accountability is, I think, an important thing for us to consider. And they do this in a couple of different ways. So we have long talked about the role of nonprofit organizations as policy advocates, pushing or certain policies or opposing other policies to improve conditions for the people that they serve or their mission that they have. We also think about their role as policy implementers, particularly as service providers, right? How they're the ones that are making the policy come alive on the ground. One area that we, I think, are just starting to think more about is their role also as policy formulators, as working with government to co-create different public policies in formal ways in order to improve representation. So when we think about this, this is a way that nonprofits can become more involved in improving sort of a democratic way of thinking about things without necessarily moving through the electoral system. So one way of doing that, that we see increasingly in the United States, given a shrinking public sector workforce and an increased role of nonprofits in service provision, is through something called collaborative governance. And that's essentially a variety of different ways in which private stakeholders are brought into public policy making in consensus-oriented ways. So this might be look like different advisory groups or task forces or select panels that are brought together to provide expertise on particular issues and areas. So, for example, this could be in a rural area, a network of organizations, bringing together organizations that perhaps serve youth, another that serves the elderly, and another maybe that focuses on the well-being of farming communities, to talk about what priorities in that area should be and how they can best bring the different groups together so that everyone's needs are met. Another example might be thinking about trying to resolve issues of poverty in urban contexts. In order to do that, you need to talk to folks that are working on issues of food security, nonprofits that are working in an area of housing and education and youth, right? And so getting everyone at the table together to be able to talk about those things is a way of making sure that different voices are heard, right? And the kinds of expertise that arises from nonprofits' important service provision role is heard in that policy-making context. So these groups might have responsibility for example, setting priorities for what government should be thinking about doing first, what kinds of initiatives should be prioritized, or what projects should be funded. Now, when we think about different kinds of groups like this, or different governance processes in this way, there's important risks and benefits. So in terms of benefits, right, there's a really important mutual learning opportunity here for people who are doing work on the ground to be able to learn what policy-making constraints are, but also for government to learn from the expertise of folks who are doing this work on the ground and who are working with affected communities every day. There's also important benefits in terms of potentially making government more accountable to people who are on the ground by hearing about what's going on and by involving them in policymaking, and also potentially expanding the influence of nonprofit service providers who have this information. There's also important risks, though. There's always a balance when you think about these things between collaboration and co-optation. So there's a risk that the only nonprofits that are invited to attend are organizations that are already providing services in the way that government wants them provided, or that once nonprofit leaders who are involved in these processes are there, they stop feeling so accountable to the communities that they serve and become feeling more accountable to keeping their government partners happy. Or they could be processes that aren't really very meaningful at all, that they're mostly just for show, to try to pretend as though these nonprofits have a voice when really government is going to do what they want anyway. So these are obviously all risks, but there's a lot of potential upsides as well if we think about this. The United States and China have very different political systems, and this may look very different in those, but I think it's interesting to think about how a process like this could work in the Chinese context as well. It's been growing very rapidly in the United States as a way to try to improve accountability and sort of democratic representation in different contexts. So when we think about this, just to sum up, it's important to think about the role of nonprofits as not just as service providers, but also as having an expert voice that could improve policymaking in a variety of ways. We need to allow government to learn from them. If they're going to have this responsibility to be delivering all of these services, government needs to be able to learn from their experience in doing that. And be able to include that voice in policymaking in a variety of ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mosley. Our next speaker will be Dr. Xueguang Zhou, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Peking University, as well as Deputy Director of the China Social Work Research Center, a joint institution of Peking University and Hong Kong Polytechnic University. His research focuses on poverty, social development, and child welfare, with recent projects covering topics like child poverty, financial capability of youth, and community development. In his role with the China Social Work Research Center, he has helped to foster the integration of social work theory and practice, to indigenize and professionalize social work, and ultimately to make contributions to social problem solving and social development writ large. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deng.
It's my great honor to be part of this panel. As Professor Zhou mentioned earlier, the involvement of non-governmental sector in China, particularly in social welfare provision and community development, has become increasingly important. Especially in the past decade, China has entered a period of so-called deepening its reform and opening up. So the process of economic and social transition had been accelerated, posing considerable challenges to the party and the state governance capacities. It is worth to note that in 2017, the 19th National Congress of Communist Party pointed out that the principal social contradiction became the gap between unbalanced and inadequate development and people's ever-growing needs for a quality life, including particularly access to quality education, health care, and also better environment. So strengthening the social welfare system is viewed as one of the key components of overall governance framework in a vision to achieve sustainable development while maintaining social political stability. At the same time, with the economic growth, we have also seen the rapid development of China's philanthropic sector. There has been significant growth in charitable giving and volunteering. Social sector's participation in response to those addressing the social problems and also marginalized people's needs has greatly contributed to the social governance and also presented a unique co-production model with Chinese characteristics. And I would like to take poverty alleviation as an example. As you may know, since 2013, China has launched a so-called War on Poverty, which is the Chinese version of a War on Poverty action for building a moderately prosperous society in all respects. And the government declared its victory in eradicating extreme poverty in last year. So China's remarkable progress regarding poverty reduction was often attributed to the strong government leadership, but the role of non-governmental sector received less attention. Actually, I found official data showing that social organization has extensively participated in the fight against the poverty, implemented more than 90,000 service programs, and invested about $18 billion in various types of funds. I think the Chinese government adopted the whole society approach in poverty alleviation by encouraging multi-stakeholders, including governmental agencies, the private sector, social organizations, and also individuals to participate in the poverty alleviation action. Similarly, you can also see it is argued that one of the key elements to China's COVID-19 prevention and control is decentralizing containment strategies to neighborhoods and the communities. So I think in various social welfare fields, we have found, I call a state-led co-production mechanism, which is distinct from the US and many other Western countries. The involvement of non-governmental sector is deeply integrated into the overall national policy agenda. The government, with its visible and enabling hands, plays active role in not only initiating, financing, facilitating, but also monitoring and regulating social organizations. The operation of state-led co-production mechanism certainly faces challenges, including such as how to strengthen the accountability of contracting out services, how to promote greater civic engagement, and how to improve the influence of NGOs on policy making. As Jennifer said, also in the U.S. context, this is also very important. How to the involvement of NGOs into the policy making and increase the accountability of the government, which is also challenging in the Chinese context. I think I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to more discussions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Deng. So in terms of these opening remarks, our final speaker will be Dr. Nicole Marwell, who is Associate Professor in the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice here at the University of Chicago, as well as Faculty Director of the school's program in Social Sector Leadership and Nonprofit Management. Professor Marwell is also an affiliate of the Department of Sociology, Fellow in the Center for Spatial Data Science, and Advisory Council Member for the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. Her research examines urban governance with a focus on the diverse intersections between nonprofit organizations, government bureaucracies, and politics. She focuses on understanding cities as complex and shifting sets of interorganizational relations, and tries to take advantage of this meso-level social structure to understand how that affects urban cohesion, inequality, and exclusion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marwell.
Thanks, Alan, and it's a great pleasure to be here with my colleagues here in Chicago and also my Chinese colleagues. I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. I wanted to start by raising the question that's been touched on by several of the other panelists using somewhat different words. On the one hand, the idea of decentralization between the state and social sector organizations, but what I would call here in the United States much more a question of fragmentation between the state and the various social sector partners that attempt to participate collaboratively in providing social services, addressing social welfare needs, and addressing inequality. This fragmentation raises a major challenge, which is the challenge of accountability, which has also been pointed to by several of my colleagues on the panel tonight. How do we, in a decentralized or fragmented system of social welfare provision, how do we pursue accountability? And how, in a society like the United States, where we have diverse, sometimes very conflicting views about what we should be doing to address these challenges, how do we think about the question of accountability, and can we all move in the same direction, or are we actually looking for different things? In the US context, I think we find that one of the strategies that we look towards for addressing this question of accountability is by turning to data, right? Turning to measurement, turning to the ways in which we can attempt to quantify and standardize the kinds of outcomes that we're interested in pursuing. In the United States, we have a long history of this type of approach to the accountability challenge. Begins with the new public management movement, which you can also see in the UK and other European nations, where outcome measurements are put forward as a way to say we're driving towards these particular goals. Nonprofit organizations need to set their goals in accordance with particular outcomes, need to develop theories of change that are aimed at particular outcomes. You need to track these outcomes, report on these outcomes, financial support from government, also from philanthropy, can be directed towards organizations that are pursuing the outcomes that are thought to be the most important. And this idea of performance metrics, outcome measurement, and so on is really generalized across all sectors in the United States. You see it not only, of course, in business, but also in government, in philanthropy, in nonprofit organizations. Everybody is extremely interested in producing these types of measurements in order to try and address the problem of accountability. More recently, we've seen fast emerging changes in the use of data for addressing this kind of accountability challenge. In all sectors of society, we see the proliferation of new forms of data, new sources of data, new forms of data analysis. And this is really proliferating challenge for us where we're awash in so much data that sometimes it can be very difficult to figure out which is the right data, how reliable are these data, can we find comparability across these data, and a variety of similar kinds of questions. For the question of social welfare and for addressing problems of inequality, there is a reality to using data to track these things. It can be a very useful tool. But I also want to point to the challenges of relying so much on data. Sometimes it feels as if we think that data is the answer to everything, as if the only real form of knowledge comes in quantified measurements. And I, for one, would want to caution against that kind of an orientation, to thinking that the uncertainty of making progress on complex social processes, such as the ones involved in the improvement of social welfare and the reduction of inequality, that these are processes that can be informed to some extent by a reliance on data and different kinds of data, but that also requires important human expertise, knowledge from different cultural communities, recognition that different groups have different ideas about what progress looks like. And so it's really critically important not to let data eat the entire conversation, but rather that we need to think about data as just one source of knowledge and information among many others that we want to keep involved as well.
Thank you, Professor Marwell. So moving on to a bit of discussion here amongst the panelists. One important trend that was highlighted in both the Chinese and US contexts across several of the remarks is this increasing prevalence of co-production models, situations where NGOs and governments jointly deliver public services. So there's a general question to the panel. Given your own research and experiences, what is needed in order for co-production models to help make service delivery more responsive to different communities? I think we'll have time for comments from several of the panelists, so I'll turn it over first to Professor Deng.
Question, and also both in the US and in the Chinese context, we have seen the increasing co-production mechanism or models to help make social service delivery more responsive. But different from other lower income countries, I think the Chinese government, in Chinese context, the government has strong willingness to take responsibility to providing public services and goods to meet the ordinary people's expectation for a better life. So this is largely consistent with the mission of most of non-governmental organizations. So I agree with many researchers' opinion that the discussion of civil society issues and also co-production models has a very different starting point from many Western countries. So co-production is thus viewed as a means to strengthen rather than weaken the state's governance capacity. So of course, as I discussed earlier, state-led co-production also faces challenges. In order to promote NGOs to better coordinate with the government to address social problems, and I think the first it's very important to create institutional incentives for effective co-production, such as providing more flexible and innovative way of contracting out mechanism, and also strengthening the state's ability to supervise and evaluate service outcomes, and also making better use of the data. The big data platform now is very popular in China. And second, I think it is very important to build the professional capacity of many social service agencies in China, and also empower service users' involvement in the whole process of service delivery. Actually, there are some good cases in China. Apart from the poverty alleviation and the COVID-19 prevention and control, we have also seen recently some innovative social service program using co-production mechanism, such as the Rural Community-Based Child Protection Project, and also some social organization incubation project in urban cities, or some other smaller bottom-up community service programs. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Deng. In terms of the same question, what is really needed for responsive co-production? Professor Mosley, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, and I want to, I guess, underline one thing that Professor Deng said, which I think is really important, which is that we shouldn't think about co-production as a method, as something that's necessarily going to weaken the state, but really as something that can strengthen it. Co-production in its ideal sense is a way for, under one umbrella for, ideally nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations can be involved in different diverse communities and be meeting their needs in a diversity of ways. Doing this in partnership with government allows government to meet the needs of a diverse population and diverse needs in a more effective and respectful and responsive way. So this can actually strengthen the relationship between these communities and government in many ways. But in order to do this, right, we need to actually recognize that diversity of practice. So I think the danger is in co-production really not happening in a respectful, in an authentic way. Increasingly, we see, and I think we're going to talk about this again in a little bit, but we see government wanting to enforce a sort of through these partnerships, because using different kinds of data and accountability to enforce different kinds of top-down solutions to social problems. We know that something works. We want to collect evidence, show that something works, and then deliver that service to a wide variety of nonprofits in order to get that evidence-based program out there. That's the opposite of co-production in many ways. It doesn't allow for voices from the ground and for diverse communities for their expertise and their knowledge and their way of solving problems to be honored within that system. And so I think that we need to recognize the dangers that can come from not meeting co-production in an authentic sense.
Thank you very much, Professor Mosley. In terms of a final response on this first question around responsive co-production, I'll turn the stage back over to Professor Zhou.
Thanks, Alan. I think our panelists have already touched on a variety of co-production models between governments and the NGOs. And certainly they vary greatly from different societies in different areas, from subcontracting, collaboration, and even fragmentation, as Nicole put it. My sense is that this relationship may vary across different areas and tasks. Governments and NGOs have comparative advantages and disadvantages in information gathering, in processing information, and in responsiveness. And they also face very different kind of constraints, right, in terms of resources, regulatory environments, and also shareholders they have to respond to. So I guess in some cases, we observe that governments take a leading role, especially in those areas of equal access to safety net in key welfare components. Right? In other areas, it's probably much better to let NGOs to take over or play a much larger role. So the key issue, I guess, would be to learn and to figure out what is the most effective way of organizing that putting different things together in response to changing, evolving situations we face in public arena. So I don't think there's one formula fit all. Rather, we have to be more responsive and adaptive.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhou. We're building from this discussion of co-production. A second important theme that came out across the remarks and across some of these comments we just heard is the role that service delivery contracts can play in sort of pulling NGOs toward the goals of the state and also defining how evaluation occurs. So considering the two contexts that we've had at hand, China and the United States, as a general question to the panelists, how have we seen evidence be used effectively to help address social inequality, and what have been some of the major challenges? Again, we'll have time for a few of the panelists to respond here, so I think I'll turn it over first to Professor Marwell.
Yeah, there have been many efforts, I think, to try to produce evaluation that helps us move in a positive direction towards solving important social challenges. And while both nonprofit organizations, governments, philanthropies have long attempted evaluation of different kinds, There's been a trend in the last probably 2 decades, particularly since the work of economists in international development around using evidence-based practice to really move what we refer to as net impact, to do interventions that can be determined with usually a randomized controlled trial or some other kind of approach that addresses this question of net impact. Does this intervention actually, is it responsible for making change? And can you really say this is the thing that quote unquote works? And there's certainly been a lot of resources driving that conversation, driving a particular method of evaluation. And there have been some important gains from that type of an approach. At the same time, however, the move of resources towards that particular kind of evaluation has also started to choke off resources for other kinds of evaluation. And so I guess as a society, we need to make the decision about, is this particular kind of evaluation, this idea of net impact, that we can track the effects of a particular program with statistical significance? Is this the only kind of evaluation in which we are interested? Or are we interested in a broader set of evaluations as well? And this is a question that I think redounds not only to what are the programs that we think work, but much more importantly, gets involved in a larger political economy of how we're choosing to spend our resources for the improvement of social welfare. So for example, in the United States right now, we've seen the emergence of a movement to say we should only be spending government funds on programs that we can prove work. And there's an argument for that, for sure. But there's also a downside to it. And so we really need to be careful again about how we draw conclusions from a particular view of the world that relies on a particular form of evaluation and a particular kind of data. And we want to ask ourselves, are there other things that also matter to us? And should we be supporting those and learning how to understand and talk about those with the kind of legibility that we can talk about a randomized control trial and the notion that a particular intervention works?
Thank you, Professor Marwell. Sort of continuing on this theme of service delivery contracts on the one hand and sort of the effective or problematic use of evidence on the other, Professor Zhou, I believe you had some thoughts to share on this topic as well.
Yeah, from what I learned in the literature, Chinese government has been very effective in adopting technologies and big data to gather information regarding the needs of social groups in administering social welfare programs, as well as implementation processes, including those service delivery contracts. So these technologies do play a positive role in facilitating the implementation of public policy in goods delivery. In terms of challenges, I agree with several panelists already touched on this topic, that we really should be mindful of the potential problems, especially associated with the bureaucratic use of information. For example, information gathering, retrieval, interpretation all require human intervention, which may infuse in this process selective attention, special interests, and other goals that may be at odds to public interests. I think these are the kind of issues we have to face in this when we think about how to work with big data, information technology in public policy implementation processes.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhou. Professor Mosley, the stage is yours as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I think when we think about this, one of the issues when we think about evidence-based practices and evidence-based policies, that when we think about evidence-based practices, it's a great thing. We want to know that what we're doing is working, right? But going out and trying to find all the different programs and testing each one individually through a randomized control trial is an extremely expensive and inefficient way of ultimately figuring out what works. There are many, many programs out there that could be very effective. We just don't know because we haven't tested them. I think that we'll never have enough time and money to go out and test every program that's coming up in every community that have been created by people that are part of that community, that care about that community, are embedded in that community, and have a sense that they know what works in that community. Now, sometimes they might be wrong and sometimes they might be right? But we can't, it's not going to work to go out and try to find every single one, and it's just, we're never going to get there, especially in countries as large and as China and the United States, where you have so many different areas and so many different needs. So I would say that a different way of thinking about this is perhaps that government should be encouraging more of an organizational learning approach, of helping to build capacity within organizations and within communities to be able to evaluate more quickly and rapidly on the ground what is working in their own organizations, to do their own assessments, and to be able to figure that out in a way that's more similar to what you might think about as a design-based process or even an agile process, to be able to learn quickly on the ground instead of going through multiple levels of trials that then by the time that you have that, you're trying to reach fidelity to a program that is being that has been tested in one context that may not even hold to another. So I think that ultimately, if we're going to be successful in thinking about evaluation, we need to think about this a little differently.
Thank you very much, Professor Mosley. As a way to sort of think about concluding this portion of the panel, I think it's useful for us to return to a kind of pluralistic ideal that really motivates a lot of the people both working in this space and studying that. And namely, a scenario where NGOs and other social organizations are able to support and extend public service delivery, they can help better address the diverse needs of different communities at the local level, but still also be able to hold state officials accountable and advocate for change. So if we want to try to move closer to that kind of ideal, given the cases we've been discussing this evening, as a general question to the panelists, what is the most important issue to consider or problem to address related to social sector governance? And so we'll have time for each of the panelists to comment here, and we'll take them in the order of the original remarks. So Professor Zhou, would you please start us off?
Thank you, Alan. In my opening remarks, I pointed out that China and the US are in the opposite end of this spectrum in terms of governance styles. I think our panel has discussed different aspects of these two models already. In my view, really there's much to learn from each other between these two models. And I think a better choice probably lies somewhere in the middle. It's a mixture of these two models. For example, I think that the US has much to learn from the Chinese model in the sense of there's much room for the US government at different levels to play a more active role in addressing public goods provision problems, especially in terms of social issues like homeless, crime, mental health, poverty, racial and ethnic tensions and conflicts. These are the huge issues that face this country and this society. I also imagine that if the Chinese government gives more autonomy to social organizations, to allow them to experiment and grow, I think these organizations can play a much larger and active role in addressing major challenges in this rapid changing society in China. I think also facilitate the growth of a great civil society there. So I really want to thank you, the conference organizers, to giving us this opportunity to think and ponder about this set of issues. So this is a great occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. Professor Mosley.
Yes, I think I would say that if we are going to rely on nonprofit and other non-governmental organizations to provide these services, government also needs to be open to learning from them. We should not only be thinking about non-governmental organizations as service providers as a way of sort of more efficiently outsourcing government work. This shouldn't be a way of more cheaply doing things or simply simply a matter of efficiency. This is a way of really becoming more accountable to diverse communities, of reaching more people in different ways, right? And nonprofits should be compensated for that work in ways that allows them to do it that is robust and inclusive of the communities that they work in.
Thank you, Professor Mosley. Next, Professor Deng.
In China, when discussing the social sector governance, many people are very concerned about the fragmentation of NGOs in delivering services. I think either in the post-disaster relief or COVID-19 prevention and control, and how to integrate the action and the resources of NGOs and coordinate with the government is still a great challenge in China. In this regard, I think the government may, in Chinese context, I think government may face a challenge of like how to stimulate the vitality of social organizations, and at the same time effectively monitor them in order for effective coordination with the government. And another challenge, I think maybe the most important one, is the empowerment of service users' involvement. I think the co-production model requires the planning, design, and the delivering process of the welfare services should be more inclusive and more equal partnership among like policymakers, professionals, social workers, and also service users should be established. From my point of view, I think the foundation of social sector governance should lie on the greater civic engagement and also social solidarity. Like in times of crisis, local people are willing to give helping hands to others and we're willing to trust others. I think this is of a great significance for strengthening social cohesion and social resilience in an area of increasing uncertainty both in China and the US and internationally.
Thank you very much, Professor Deng. Professor Marwell.
Well, my fellow panelists have hit all the big ones here. I'm wondering what's left. But I think I'm going to point to an issue that bedevils us in the United States, and I imagine in China as well, which is the reality of conflict. You know, the idea of social cohesion is extremely important, but at the same time, social organizations, nonprofit organizations are an important vehicle for voicing conflicting views. And Alan, you used the word pluralism to talk about, you know, how you sort of resolve these competing voices and conflicting ideas in the marketplace of ideas, or however you want to call it. But, you know, we're having a breakdown of that system in our country right now, very significant breakdown. And certainly in China, there is some reluctance to hear the voices of marginalized groups as well. So when the challenge of how you hear the voices that are speaking out in conflicting ways and find a way to maintain social cohesion in the face of that, I think this is a critical challenge.
Thank you very much, Professor Marwell. And thanks again to all of the panelists for sharing their insights, their research, their own experiences on these important topics. I believe we have some time available for audience questions. Are there any questions anyone wanted to put forward to the panel? I see a hand up there. I think that's the only one I see currently, so please go ahead. I think there's a microphone coming down to you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Andrew Frangos, and I'm a PhD student at our School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. My question comes from quite a few people mentioned the importance of the nonprofit sector for collaboration or for policy input. And so I wanted to turn, though, to Professor Deng mentioned the importance of also receiving input from service users, not just service providers. And so I'm curious if some of you might be able to say a little more about the state of incorporating service users into design or accountability processes in the US and in China, and also maybe what possibilities and problems increased reliance on technology might pose toward that.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think we've got two parts. One that's about the voices of clients and users in this process, and the other about technology. So maybe on that first point, the one about involving service users, did any of the panelists want to chime in on that point?
I think that that's a really important question, and I think I would answer it in a couple of ways. One, I think that the relationship between incorporating the voice of users within an organization and then incorporating users in policymaking are not quite so separate, right? So in order for nonprofit organizations to actually be able to represent the communities that they serve well in these kinds of processes that I'm talking about, they need to have a close relationship with their users. And that would come ideally through better integration of those users into their organization, right? To be able to actually be in constant communication with them and know what they want. I think that there is some danger when we're thinking about nonprofit organizations and as their political voice of overestimating the degree to which nonprofit organizations can legitimately speak on behalf of all of these communities. The communities that they serve are very heterogeneous, and I think that there's an inclination sometimes to speak from our own sense of knowledge or that we know what people need, right? And that may or may not be the case. And so when users are more robustly integrated into organizations, organizations can also do a better job of representing their interests in the ways that they're included into.
Thank you. Other thoughts from the panel?
I may just add my 2 cents of view on this. I think that we can talk about 2 approaches to incorporating service users into this co-production processes. One is the market approach that companies normally would do, right? They will try to respond to service users, whatever requests and complaints, and make adjustments. But in terms of nonprofit organizations or nonprofit sectors, I think one of the key factors, I'm thinking in terms of the Chinese context, is how to get the service users organized in certain ways so that they can voice their views in a way that is more, better, I guess, organized, clearer messages, and also persistent to put pressures on these nonprofit organizations and the government to improve their performance. And that's the part I think we are talking about civil society and civil groups organized among themselves. And this is, I think, one issue that is relatively underdeveloped in a Chinese context.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. Professor Deng, it looked like you were going to chime in as well, so I'll give you a space.
Yeah, I think the Professor Zhou already mentioned that. I think the community level co-production is is critical for the service users involvement, as live in the same community, and they have. I think there should be a mechanism to connect each other. And so here in Chinese context, recent decade, we have seen the emerging social workers has played a very important role at the community level co-production promotion. So I think it's very important for the service users to have a mechanism to organize themselves and also to voice out their needs and also some other concerns. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The second part of the question around technology, I'm not sure if that's where you were going to go, but go where you wish. Yeah.
I was just going to speak to the first part of the question as well. I think it's a huge challenge as to how you get service users to organize or to voice their views and to have the kind of time and knowledge that allows them to engage with nonprofit organizations, with state bureaucrats, with philanthropies. It's asking an awful lot of service users to engage in this kind of co-production. And I think we need to do a better job thinking about how we make that process of participation more accessible, how we potentially use technological affordances to bring in those kinds of voices, how we might design such technological affordances in order to make that participation easier without at the same time being completely anomic. So I think it's a huge challenge on which we give a lot of lip service to it. I'm not sure that we do a very good job of actually making it happen. Actually, I'm pretty sure we don't.
Thank you very much, Professor Marwell. Maybe we'll see if there are any other questions from the audience. Okay, lots of hands. I think I saw this one here first. Please go ahead. I think there should be a microphone probably coming down shortly.
In the yellow sweater.
Yep, right here.
Hi, thank you all very much for this engaging conversation. My name is Fan Mei, alum from Paris, and also currently working at the Center for the Economics of Human Development. So my question is towards Professor Mosley's earlier comment on the organizational learning approach. And I was wondering if you could comment more on that, especially if you have any anecdote or examples that you can think of that in what context it has been implemented successfully, or on the other hand, it wasn't successful, and what were the situations, and what could be the potential factors that contribute to it? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that a colleague of mine, Mary Kay Guberty, talks about is around sort of right fit evaluation. So, nonprofit organizations come in lots of different sizes, lots of different capacities, and what might be a good fit for a large, professionalized, formalized organization that has a big history and a lot of philanthropic support in a city may not be the case for a small grassroots organization. And so we really need to think more about how we can better fit our evaluation sort of strategies to different organizational capacities and capabilities. So when we think about an organizational learning approach, one way that people often think about that is through a design-based approach. So, for example, as you are delivering a service to build in, there's different, there's many different models for doing this. So like plan, do, study, think, act, I didn't get that right, cycles, right? And other things like that where you sort of build in evaluation at regular intervals into your regular process to answer questions, and then build in sort of rapid changes, right? So that then you can evaluate that in your next cycle rather than waiting for the whole sort of process to change, right? Or waiting for the whole evaluation cycle to complete. And to really think also about the mechanisms of change. That's one thing that sort of randomized controlled trials aren't always the best at, is thinking about why something worked, but rather whether something did or didn't. An organizational learning approach might be thinking more about why a certain approach worked by trying out a couple of different things over time, right? And being in communication with the people they're working with around those things. So it's just a really different way of thinking about it, that's a better fit sometimes for organizations at different levels of capacity.
Thank you, Professor Mosley.
Jennifer and I, when we talk about this distinction between organizational learning and a randomized controlled trial, for example, we find sometimes the analogy between engineering versus science can be useful. So in engineering orientation, you're watching what's happening, you're making iterative adjustments as you go along, building the thing you're building, rather than a science approach, which really holds everything constant, wants to see what the effect of the particular intervention is. There are benefits to both of these approaches. For organizations that are trying to improve their services rapidly as they go, they may be more inclined towards an engineering approach because it feels like they're being more responsive, whereas a scientific approach feels like the time horizon is so long that it can really, undermine their sense of being responsive to their community.
Thank you, Professor Marwell. I saw a few other hands come up last time. Okay, so right here, we can maybe get a microphone, or you can go that way. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Victor. I'm a second-year college student at UChicago. And first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I think it's mostly been theoretical, and my question might are a little bit more on the practical side. Back in China, I was from China, and back in China, I was leading and managing a student organization that bridges families with kids with serious diseases with the respective charity organizations and foundations to provide them with medical reliefs and financial reliefs. And the thing that I find really interesting when I was doing those works were the hardest thing was not to find funds, it's not to find foundations, but to convince those people that we can help them, to prove our creditworthiness and our credibility to them. I think this is very unique in China, and I just want to ask Professor Zhou and Professor Zhou and Professor Deng, what are your opinions on this matter, and how does it come into being, and how might we tackle them in the days coming ahead? And also to Professor Mosley and Professor Marwell, about, do you think there's a similar credibility crisis happening in NGOs in the United States or other developed countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Victor.
Okay, maybe I just start this conversation. I think this is a very good question, very good observation. Partly, I think the reason why there's a lack of trust and credibility among social groups and social organizations like you run while you were in China is there's a lack of civil society. That is, you don't have many organizations, charity organizations, or organizations that try to promote these public courses around you. So people develop this kind of, the traditional view, right? You seek help from your family, from your kinship, from your close friends, rather than in a public place, because this is something they are not familiar with. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is in recent years, there are a lot of reported stories about people, bad stories about using social media, using so-called social organizations try to cheat, try to funnel money, things like that. I think in this case, there's also a need for government regulations in the nonprofit organization or nonprofit sector, right? I think Professor Deng talked about different kind of mobilizations at a neighborhood level or a community level that can't really help. I think that's at least the starting point.
Yeah, I can. I think Professor Zhou already covered most of the points. In Chinese context, the social trust is kind of a challenge because the people tend to trust the government, trust their kinship network, trust their family, but they are not used to trust the strangers. So in China, recent decade, we have seen the emerging NGOs and also social work profession. They try to provide help to strangers. So that is a kind of a different cultural issue. So I think in terms of trust, I think there are two kinds of trust. The first one is the interpersonal relationship, because people used to trust their family members and trust their kinship networks. Another thing is institutional trust. That is, like a social work profession or professional. They are kind of providing help to strangers. So in terms of your cases, I think maybe the clients are not used to trust the professionals. Although you claim you are social workers or you can provide a very professional help, but I think the clients and the service users are not used to that kind of a relationship. So I think probably that's a case very typical in China.
I mean, I think that may be a problem that is a little bit more unique to China. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that, Professor Marwell. But I think in the United States, the government has a much larger credibility problem than the nonprofit sector does. And so, it's a little bit different. I think our sort of rugged individualist kind of culture, people feel actually more concerned about taking what they would call handouts, right, from the government than they would from a sort of sense of charity, which feels a little bit maybe like people want to do it and it doesn't have the same sort of moral valence that taking support from the government does. So this may be one area in which our different cultures and relationships to government are quite different.
So I agree with you that people are more distrustful in this country of government than necessarily of nonprofit organizations, but I think there's a serious trust problem with nonprofit organizations as well. I'm thinking right now of the sort of multi-sectoral effort that started here in Chicago at the onset of the pandemic, where the Chicago Public Schools, a bunch of philanthropic organizations, some nonprofit organizations came together also with internet service providers to provide free internet to children in Chicago public schools and who were under a certain level of income. And free offer, they made it quite easy to sign up. It was for 4 years, right? And there was still a lot of hesitation and many, many eligible children who did not take up that offer. And so to me, that's a sign also of a lack of trust in this notion that why would someone give me something for free, something that's clearly valuable? Why would they give it to me for free? That just kind of doesn't happen in this rugged individualist kind of a country, right? And so, I think that some of the strongest relationships of trust really do come in the nonprofit sector in the United States from organizations that really are community-based, right? For whatever weird reason, we now refer to all nonprofit organizations in this country as community-based, which they are not. The ones that really do have deep roots in communities will be able to overcome these trust barriers much more easily, while larger nonprofits or nonprofits that have been founded by social entrepreneurs who are not from the communities they're trying to serve, or these other types of nonprofit organizations are going to face that kind of distance, that kind of lack of trust, I think, as well. So it's not so much about this sector's trusted, this sector isn't. Because also, local government can sometimes be much more trustworthy for people than, say, state or certainly federal government. So I think there's a lot of within-sector variation on trust, and it's not so much we trust this sector, but we don't trust that one.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. We'll go up there, please.
Hi, my name is Casey. I'm a graduate of the Crown School. I wanted to actually build on Professor Marwell's points about the pandemic, and I'm just wondering to kind of bring this from sort of a theoretical space to kind of more concrete examples within the pandemic, right? How has government responses, NGO responses to the pandemic revealed where we need to go with service in the future, and how did it sort of reveal the strengths within China and the United States' service orientation before? So I guess, how has the pandemic really shaped a lot of this conversation and in terms of where we are and where we need to go?
Well, I think it's a question for all of us, but I guess I can start. The pandemic has been a terrible thing, and it also has created a sense of urgency across a number of different areas that I think has the potential, we're not there yet, but has the potential to move the needle on some things that people have been working on for a long time, but that have sort of gotten stagnated. So I'm working on this question of internet access and equity. And that's an area, for example, where there's been, despite 25 years of digital equity activism that had been going on, the pandemic just pulled the curtain off of this reality of digital inequity and has really moved the needle both in government, $60 billion just appropriated for broadband in the recent federal bill, and continuing urgency on the part of many, many different stakeholders around this question. So that's just one example. I'm sure that there are others.
Would any of the other panelists like to chime in on sort of the pandemic and its consequences or the way it shaped any of the topics we've talked about?
Okay, if I can jump in here. In the Chinese context, I think the government played a decisive role. And probably it is appropriate because in terms of pandemic, you do want a strong authority that can coordinate, different kind of, medical support, but also, in a way, directing traffic and also, what we call shelter in place. And as we all know, then sometimes the government also play a coercive role, in blocking traffic and then, forcing people to be quarantined. And probably in this larger context of pandemic, these are, the roles that it is, I don't know whether we can say this justified or not, or appropriate or not, but certainly it helped in containing the pandemic. And also Chinese government, I mentioned this before, has multi-layered local governments down to the village, down to the neighborhood, down to the community. So that's why it is really totally organized. It's much easier for the government to mobilize that capacity to deal with the pandemic. And in that contrast, I don't think NGOs play that much role in this pandemic. I may be wrong, so I leave this to Professor Deng to correct me, please.
Yeah, I think the very important thing is I think it's also fit our discussion earlier, the co-production model, in terms of the pandemic's impact, on everything. So the co-production model should be, I think should be changed to not only to providing the concrete services, but more important to build the community trust and also social solidarity. I think that is a very important challenge and also important task for the co-production model in the future.
I might add is just the degree to which the pandemic showed that even though the United States has the most robust nonprofit sector in the world, the way that the degree of enmeshment with the government of that sector really showed the weakness in our formal safety net. One thing that we really learned during the pandemic is the need for, we saw a huge growth of different kinds of informal organizations, mutual aid processes, grassroots efforts to really help people on the ground level in communities outside of the formal nonprofit sector that is in partnership with government. And so I think that it really, also opened a curtain in some ways to the way in which the increasing formalization of the nonprofit sector and its capacity to serve as a safety net provider, as a partner with government, has also left some people sort of literally in the cold. Because of the bureaucratic nature of that, their lack of trust in it. There's a variety of different reasons, but I think the growth of more mutual aid efforts is something that I'm really keeping my eye on, and I think others are too, as a sort of a corrective to an sort of overly formalized nonprofit sector.
Thank you very much. I see another hand there, so please go ahead.
Hello, my name is David Dalk. I'm an alum of the Booth School. And I want to come back to your comment about the pandemic, and this is for all poor panelists, is, it's created enormous, never before seen standard deviations in income equality. Not only just the CEO to the bottom, but just people that have just forgotten about the process. I was at my first conference at McCormick Place after the pandemic, and the Xueguang guy said he didn't qualify for employment because he got paid cash. Stuff like this. There's and then there's differences between the two countries and how those things work. But I think there's at this moment a greater danger of people falling out of society altogether than there ever has been. And how should NGOs and governments be responding to that?
I think in some ways that was kind of what I was trying to get at a little bit with my last point, is I think that the way in which the nonprofit sector ideally is a way in which where people on the ground can come together to get their needs met in ways that are outside of government. But in the United States, the nonprofit human services sector is increasingly a very close partner with government, and so responsive to all of the different sort of policies and rules and norms and regulations that come with that. And that means that people like the Xueguang guy, right, get left out of that, and increasingly others as well. And I think that's why we see this turn to more how can communities help themselves. We see this huge rise in GoFundMes and other things, right, that are outside of this system. And so I think that it really does sort of call on us to think about the ways in which we can maybe need to think about how the nonprofit sector can reach back into its roots a little bit more and make sure that it is being responsive to all of those needs, right, and not just their certain specific sort of designated group of people who they are supposed to serve with this particular pot of government funds, when it's all eligibility requirements and everything else.
Or you can flip to completely the other side from mutual aid and say that the state needs to be doing more, right? I mean, the Xueguang guy who gets paid in cash wouldn't have been eligible for unemployment assistance even before the pandemic, right? That's not the way our unemployment system is set up. And so, what is the role that the state should be playing in setting a floor for economic inclusion, setting a floor for social inclusion, while at the same time respecting the long-held American values of self-sufficiency and democratic voice. These are, I think, long-standing challenges in our welfare state in this country, for which the nonprofit sector tries to step in and supplement. But given what Jennifer has said about the formalization of the nonprofit sector and the ways in which there are people who are not being held by that either, you really have to ask, where's the entry point?
In terms of the Chinese context, I wonder if there might be either parallels or contrasting thoughts from Professor Zhou or Professor Deng on this broad topic.
Professor Deng, you are much more familiar in the Chinese context than I do. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, actually, I don't know, because this is indeed a problem. The pandemic has changed. People are talking about the shifting of the welfare state paradigm or regime. In China, the Chinese government placed the most emphasis on the employment and also in the community level service provision. So the pandemic also has get under very strict control. And so Chinese response to COVID-19 is very different from other countries. I think both the governmental intervention and also community level cooperation, also individual cooperation from the citizens, I think is very important, required. And also try to limit the negative influence on the economic development. And also for the social assistance relief, I think it's still not enough, very still limited. That's a big also problem in China. Yeah.
If I just may just add just one or two observations. I think it's interesting. I was listening to I think Jennifer and Nicole talks about in Chicago and in the U.S. context. I think the China is the opposite, whereas the government, the bureaucracies are very effective, but also very rigid. So that also makes this experience responding to COVID-19 pretty hard for people who are blocked and have to stay home for probably no particular reason at all. So I think this is another occasion you can think about NGOs, if it's cultivated, developed, can play a much useful role here to be more adaptive to specific circumstances than the government bureaucracies. So I think this is where another, I guess, illustration of the complementarity between this, government and NGOs as co-production partnership.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. Right here, please. And so my apologies to all the questions we didn't get to. So right down here in the black and yellow.
Maybe if you stand, they'll see you. Yeah.
Hi, hello. My name is Joyce. I am a first year at the undergraduate college. So my question is regarding, it's kind of broad, but it's regarding state power. So in the recent decade or two, I think, well, the way I see it is that both in US and China, there has been an increase in the amount of state power. China from a lot of power to more power, and then the US from maybe like less governmental power to the federal government, in some senses reaching over state power. And so how do you, first in the US context, how do you see this increase in like federal government power interfering or changing the relationship between the people, NGOs, and the state? And in the Chinese context, how do you see NGOs not thriving, but like becoming more of a prominent existent within the situation, like the overreaching governmental power? Yeah.
Thank you, Joyce. Yeah, we can start with the Chinese case if Professor Deng or Professor Zhao wanted to chime in, and then circle back to the US case after that.
Well, first, I do agree with the observation that the Chinese state has really increased tremendous power over time, and especially in recent years. And as I think this whole panel has been addressing this issue, there should be some kind of complementarity between NGOs and government in providing public services and implementing policies that is delivering public goods. The Chinese case, I think, is one extreme. It is, I think, among all the major economies in the world, China has really probably the most strong, tremendous organizational capacities. So when they get things right, it can deliver public goods in a very effective way. The question is when they get things wrong, or when there's areas the government bureaucracy cannot do a good job relative to, say, NGOs, then things will become very, very miserable. So I do think that the whole point is what is the best balance between not only government and nonprofit, maybe some other mechanisms built into these institutions. But I have to say, it is so difficult to promote, NGOs and all other alternatives, at least in the Chinese context.
I think it's a really interesting question. You know, the United States history is so much shorter than China's that you know, we can look back into the beginning of American history, and nonprofit organizations were noted even at the time by Alexis de Tocqueville as being used as explicitly as a brake on state power. So they were, you know, the colonists, you know, formed endlessly these associations as ways of working together outside of a strong federal government, which they distrusted. And that, so I think from even the very beginning of our history, there's been this faith in sort of private organization as being somehow a corrective, right, to state power. And then a faith in nonprofit organizations as being somehow good because they are private, because they are not part of government, and a more of a faith in them because of that. And so I think as we see the sort of the reach of the federal government grow in different ways, and you know, the federal government has waned and has sort of grown and declined over you know, the past probably, well, over the history as well. You can see how, I mean, I think you'll still see people relying, right, and maybe turning potentially more to the local nonprofits in their communities as ways of making sure that their sort of needs and priorities and values have voice in their communities outside of the federal government, and an increasingly reliance on that as a corrective.
I think my observation may be wrong. I think we did see the increasing power of the government, but we also seen the change of the way to how to use the power. I think in terms of nonprofit or non-governmental organization, the regulation of NGOs in China has great.
Oh, Professor Deng, I think your sound is gone.
No,
there,
sorry.
Now it's back. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can see the regulation of NGOs in China has gradually relied more on on laws rather on the administrative means. In the recent 5 years, China has enacted the charity law, volunteer service law, etc., and try to decouple the nonprofit organizations from the administrative department. So I think we did see the increase in the flexible way of the government to use the power and to regulate, monitor the non-government organizations.
So I think my view on this, you know, it's very hard to make generalizations about the power of government in the United States, given that, you know, due to federalism, our federalist system, governmental power is, again, so fragmented. I think my read on the last couple of decades wouldn't necessarily be that the federal government has grown in power. I think what I would notice more is that there's been such a sclerosis at the federal level, the inability to get things done at the federal government, to get any legislation through Congress, to make changes to administrative practice and law, that in fact you're seeing a lot more innovation and experimentation at the level of cities in particular, where people are saying, you know what, the federal government can't move anything along because of the political polarization we're experiencing, but at the local level we have problems to solve every day. Right, and the way in which then the governance of those problems at the local level is very much a multi-sectoral approach involving local government, but also nonprofits, also business, also communities in various ways. And so I think that the action really is at that local level, and the federal government continues to be sort of frozen in significant ways.
Wonderful. So thank you all for your engagement and your questions, and thanks again to the panelists. I believe we have closing remarks. So I will turn it back over to, maybe we don't, I'm not sure.
I have some closing remarks that are not nearly as interesting as the ones we just listened to. Okay. Just first of all, by way of thanks to the panel, great comments, a great discussion, and also some really great questions from the audience. So I really very much appreciate it. It was a very enjoyable and interesting evening. I want to thank you all again for joining us tonight and remind you that there's a reception outside of this room when we close. In spite of what I said earlier, you may remove your masks to eat and drink while at the reception, but otherwise they're meant to remain on. And I think that's it by way of closing remarks. So again, thank you to the panelists, thank you to the audience. There is one last word to invite you to tomorrow evening's event and Thursday evening as well. So there will be 2 panels tomorrow, both focused on different population groups. One focused on issues of health, mental health, and disability, and the other on children and youth. So if you are free, that would be fabulous to see you here. Thanks very much.